Okay, so now moving on to the Mercury archetype. Um, Mercury is the archetype that has to do with learning, reading, study, ideas, the mind, the teacher-student archetype. It has a lot to do with finding your voice. It's a lot to do with opening the fifth chakra and giving voice to what needs to be communicated. Um, and so it has a lot to do with writing and language and words, and it has to do with communication generally. It has to do with data. Um, Mercury is emails and phone calls, and it is letter writing. And Mercury is whenever we go to school. Mercury is whenever we sit down and talk with someone. Um, Mercury is the voice that comes through us in lots of different ways. It has something to do with the way in which we communicate. And so that's not just our words. We communicate with our bodies, with our the display of like what we wear, how we adorn ourselves. We communicate with our eyes. We communicate with our hands. It's a universal principle. It's present everywhere in everything. Everything is communicating. Everything is alive with language. This is the mystical understanding that the world is a book to be read. And every moment there are forms of communication that are happening in the world that we can tune into, that are beyond the ordinary. And so Mercury is at work whenever we hear a voice that is communicating to us, or when we see a message in the form of a synchronicity or in a dream, or when we meet the right person at the right time and they show us something that's written, or they give us a book, or they communicate something to us. This is the way in which our higher selves are often communicating to us and trying to get messages through. I'm kind of describing the Mercury-Neptune combination here, where Mercury is communication and Neptune is the dissolving of boundaries, and the way in which there can be psychic messages and intuitive messages that are coming through to us in different ways. Astrology is very much a Mercury-Neptune art form, where through understanding our birth charts and our transits, we can learn to hear the messages that our higher self has encoded in the positions of the planets at the moment of our birth. And so there's lots of questions to ask yourself when it comes to honoring the Mercury archetype, or in terms of being aware of whether you're overdosing on Mercury. Again, using a kind of metaphor as of every archetype is either a form of medicine or a form of poison. And we can have, we all need Mercury medicine, but we have to be careful about overdosing on Mercury. And we happen to live in a time on Earth where a lot of people are overdosing on Mercury in terms of, I don't mean Mercury the substance, I mean Mercury in terms of like overdosing on too many emails, too much reading, too much thinking, too much engagement of the mind. And so a big part of Mercury work is, first of all, recognizing what the mind is. And so this is where something like a meditation practice can be very helpful, where we start to observe the mind and how it works, and we start to discipline it. Right now, as I'm recording these videos, there is a Mercury-Saturn square in the sky, and that square in the sky is lining up on my own natal Saturn. And I thought about honoring that archetype in the sky and the transit that I have in a positive sense. Mercury-Saturn has a lot to do with structuring Saturn and giving form to Saturn ideas, Mercury. And so I'm trying to structure the work that I do, the teachings that I offer, and the readings that I offer, taking some of the ideas that up until this point have just been in my mind and that I share regularly with clients, but I've never actually recorded them so that people can find them anytime. And so that's a kind of positive Saturn Mercury. It has something to do with disciplining and structuring ideas in the mind. It's also the editor archetype. A lot of professional writers and professional editors have Saturn, Mercury. Saturn being mastery and Mercury being words and language. And I'm trying to do these short, focused communications, 5 to 10 minute videos on each of the archetypes. My tendency, I'm born with Mercury, Jupiter, tendency is to talk too much, to over-expand with my words and go on and on. And I'm trying to discipline myself and just do 5-10 minutes on each archetype to give a general introduction. That's a Saturn-Mercury thing, but I'm bringing it in here, the Saturn-Mercury archetype, because I mentioned meditation. And Saturn-Mercury is the archetype of disciplining Saturn, the mind, Mercury, and learning to quiet it down. So right now I'm going to honor Mercury-Saturn by being quiet for a moment. Just noticing the difference there between lots of words coming at you and a moment of a pause where there's quiet. And we all need to learn to distinguish when we're kind of caught in the mental chatter and bringing in the need for silence and quiet and getting out of our minds, dropping into our body, our feelings, our spirit. But you can do too much of that. You can reject the mind. The mind has enormous gifts to offer. It's our capacity to categorize things and to articulate things. Mercury is the gift of language and the gift of knowledge. And to me, Mercury is the principle that helps me navigate the archetypes, where I can, with my mind, name an archetype as it's happening, or be aware of a dominant archetype as it's happening, and then consciously kind of move to other archetypes, or move to bring in other archetypes. And without the mind to kind of navigate and to be able to discern the differences between different archetypes, that would be more challenging. Mercury has a lot to do with reading and the joys of reading. I'm born with a Mercury-Venus conjunction, amongst other Mercury aspects. And Venus is pleasure, Mercury is the mind. And so Venus-Mercury is the universal potential for the pleasure of the mind. Saturn-Mercury is the universal potential for feeling stuck in the mind, or getting. Saturn-Mercury has a lot to do with problem solving. And our whole culture is so much focused on problem solving and the potential for getting stuck in that kind of problem solving thought loop, as opposed to like the pleasure of just reading an awesome novel. That's more Mercury-Venus. Or the pleasure of an enjoyable conversation with someone you love. The pleasure of holding a really great book and savoring it over a period of time. That's Mercury-Venus. Mercury-Jupiter is the joys of learning, the expansive, rich experience of learning. Something like travel, Jupiter, and learning coming together is Mercury-Jupiter. Mercury-Pluto is like deep learning, deep communication, powerful words. I think of Mercury-Pluto especially as the archetype that has a lot to do with the journey towards finding our voice. If any of you have seen the film The King's Speech that won the Oscar a few years ago, that's a real Mercury-Pluto film. The King George VI, is born with a Mercury-Pluto opposition, and that journey that he went on into his own personal underworld, Pluto, to find the repressed impulse to scream at his father and his brother, and all that shadow material that's tied up in his voice that led to his stammer. But then ultimately, through the depth journey with the speech therapist who took him into an encounter with some of his shadow material, he opened that up and returned from the underworld with his voice empowered. Many of us go on that journey to find our voice. I'm currently getting really strong Mercury transits, not just the Mercury-Saturn transit that I mentioned, but other really powerful once-in-a-lifetime activations of my own natal Mercury, and thus my impulse, the strong impulse to communicate, to get the ideas that I've been working with for many years down in a recorded form. That's the Mercury area. And so I think that gives you a good sense for the Mercury archetype, and I'm going to end there.